You're listening to The Same Table. So I am Colin, and this is episode 3. And today we are looking at obstacles to date. What are some barriers to this multi-ethnic church that we want to build? So here we go. The main obstacle Multiethnic Conversations addresses is racism. Here's a quote from the book. Admittedly, racism is a charged, tough to talk about subject in American life and culture. However, those who desire a multi-ethnic Christian life cannot ignore it. Nor can we talk about building healthy multi-ethnic churches without addressing it on some level. African people were considered to be a different and inferior race from Europeans, and the same can be said of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. In fact, it was in the late 15th century where a legal framework was developed by the Catholic Church. I'm not dissing the Catholic Church, by the way, but they developed it, and it became known as the doctrine of discovery. So this doctrine allowed, affirmed the European powers to be able to conquer non-Christian lands, and it was under this framework that North and South America was divided up, and the rights of First Nations people were ignored, gave rise to a parental feeling among Europeans towards Indigenous people, which of course led to the residential schools and other terrible things we have done to the Indigenous peoples of this country. However, this concept of racism is problematic because dividing cultural and ethnic groups into different races can be arbitrary and confusing. So, for example, who can be viewed as white? That's not as simple of a solution as you might think it is. Who is considered black or colored, right? So it's a very difficult conversation. The idea of racism is, of course, contradicted by the Bible, specifically passages such as Galatians 3:26 to 29, but there are many others as well. Racist ideas become part of the society we live in, and we are all affected by it. And of course, this leads to the problem of prejudice. Here's another excerpt from the book. The word prejudice can be defined as a preformed opinion concerning someone or something. More often than not, the term is used to describe the negative or inaccurate opinions that have preformed of others with whom we have, in most cases, little or no contact. So, therefore, connection with the multi-ethnic church can be challenging, but not impossible. The goal is to get those prejudices out in the open and talk about them as a family of faith. Some prejudices are based on racist stereotypes, but others are just caused by honest cultural differences. The book uses the illustration of how different cultures approach entering a neighbor's house. Some cultures are indifferent about whether you take your shoes off or not. Others would consider a great insult to leave your shoes on. So again, we need to talk to each other. We need to listen to each other and not assume the worst about each other. And now we want to dive into unconscious bias a little bit further and deeper with the following interview.
So I'm here with Dr. Jason Chatman, who is a clinical psychologist at Dalhousie University, who stopped by to join me to talk about a really important subject when it comes to truly being a healthy multi-ethnic community. And that's those darn mind bugs called unconscious bias. And so, Dr. Chatman, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast today. And we're going to jump right in. And so let me just ask you, why do unconscious bias exist from a brain and emotional perspective? Um, how do they get there in the first place? How do these thoughts, what are they? Why do they exist in us as human beings?
Yeah, thank you, Matthew, and thank you for inviting me to this. Um, really, unconscious bias. These are those byproducts of what happens when our brain tries to process information really quickly and efficiently. Right. So they're the shortcuts. So, for example, and we're always making them. So, we're home alone and we hear a loud bang. Right. And we're already attributing that to be a threat before we even start to think about it, right? Or even in terms of just like object recognition, we see we see a chair. We don't have to look to make sure it has four legs. We don't have to do all this stuff. We just know it's a chair, right? And so what's happening is our brain takes bits of information and tries to form judgments really quickly. Sometimes that's around threat. Sometimes it's not. Right? When we think about that, there's two key systems in our brain that are involved. Our limbic system is kind of that fight or flight center, that threat detection. And it's really quick. It reacts very, very fast. And then our prefrontal cortex is our really smart part of our brain. This is the brain that, writes novels, builds bridges, does, makes works of art, right? But it's slower. It takes time, right? And so unconscious bias is when our brain has already come up with the answer, right? Or making a prediction before we've made decisions, right? And oftentimes it's, designed to detect threats. And so if we think back in our hunter-gatherer days, right? Threats were wild animals, natural disasters, but sometimes also rival tribes, right? And so we would automatically start to associate in-group versus out-group as a potential threat versus safety, right? The problem is those same systems often get used and applied to things like race, age, gender, even when it's not adaptive anymore.
Yeah, that's good. And so just to follow up with that, what would be some of the biggest influences that shape those biases over time? How do those get ingrained in our thinking?
Yeah. Well, and that's really important because bias is something that's learned, right? Through continuously, implicit exposure to certain media and information, not necessarily even just direct instruction. So it's not like people are telling us to be biased, right? Yeah. So one of the most powerful forms is just the media that we take in, right? So when we're seeing news shows where we're often seeing Black men, their mugshots around crime, right? We see that on TV over time, our brain trying to make those shortcuts, start seeing, okay, Black men, criminal, dangerous, right? Or institutional patterns. So who is in part of leadership, right? And then we start to determine, okay, leadership equals this because that's what we keep seeing, right? Now, sometimes it is family upbringing. So there might be some explicit messages from some people in our family. Oh, I don't trust this group, right? So you shouldn't trust this group. But it can also be much more implicit by who's coming over, right? What's normative versus who's excluded, right? And so if we don't get that exposure early on to differences that maybe disconfirm stereotypes, right, then we start to go with those and our brain automatically uses that when it's decision making. It could be personal experiences, especially if they're really strong emotional ones. So if I'm in a car accident or if I'm attacked by a dog, then I might start to make associations that cars or dogs are dangerous. And if I avoid those situations, if I avoid driving, if I avoid going near dogs, I never get that learning to show that those aren't always the case.
So these aren't just personal necessarily issues, but things formed in us over time through what we're exposed to.
Absolutely, absolutely. Our brain likes patterns, right? It likes to take shortcuts. And so if we see these patterns, and in our society, it's impossible not to get bombarded with these, right? It's impossible for all of us to see, to protect ourselves from these always, right? It's just turning on the TV and we see these associations right before our eyes.
Those first questions or analysis kind of talks about some of the psychology, but let's make this practical. How How does unconscious bias in us actually show up in everyday life, especially when we're thinking about diverse communities and people that have different perspectives or different cultures or languages or genders? How does an unconscious bias show up in real time in real relationships?
Yeah, well, and the interesting thing is that most bias doesn't really show up as overt discrimination, right? It's more subtle, it's pattern differences in interaction, right? Because again, bias is less about what you believe and more about what you've been repeatedly exposed to, right? And so often what we see is perhaps less eye contact, right? More physical distance, right? So it's like kind of where I sit, who I sit beside, who I tend to, congregate with, right? It might be shorter conversations. It might be I'm a bit less warm with groups that I might have this unconscious bias towards. And these are things that are happening without thought, without conscious thought. It's not like I'm choosing, I'm not going to sit next to this person because of X. My brain has already made that choice without me even thinking about it, right? It also sometimes means that we interpret things differently, right? So I might see somebody using assertive behavior, right? Somebody might see one person who's using that same behavior as a leader versus somebody else as aggressive based on characteristics that have nothing to do with the behavior, right? Or we might see somebody who's quiet, right? And one person might get the benefit of being focused, respectful, whereas another person might get disengaged, right? Job hiring. So there's a study that's titled, "Are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal?" Right? And it basically showed that when people were given resumes, right, with white sounding names or black sounding names, the people with white sounding names were 50% more likely to get callbacks, right? All other things considered equal. The resumes were exactly equal. And so really bias it operates by who gets the benefit of the doubt, right? And these could be very small interactions of where somebody sits, but it could also have very, very lasting consequences. Because if I'm carrying a cell phone and someone has to make a very snap decision about my safety, right? Somebody who has the bias of being safe might get the benefit of the doubt that it's a cell phone, whereas somebody else might not get the benefit of the doubt, and that person sees them as having a weapon.
So you can see how in real time in relationships, when we're just reacting to these patterns of how they can have, again, not necessarily malicious impact, but they can definitely undermine whether you're building trust or even in a church context. I like what you were saying about even fellowship, how sometimes maybe you're giving more time to one group versus another group, or you're uncomfortable around that group versus another group. And that's really important, I think, in a church context, because again, it's not even just what happens on Sunday at church. We're also thinking about what does it mean to do life together, to be in each other's homes or kitchen tables. And so you can really see how if there's this hesitation because something that is programmed or a pattern, why our associations can be with always people who have the same affinity or similarities to what we're interested in.
Absolutely. And again, those associations are so strong, and they're pre-verbal. They happen before we make conscious thought. So what I often see in a university setting is I'll have students who, a black student will make a comment, a point in class, and it's ignored. But 5 minutes later, a white student might say the same thing, right? And it's, now a great idea, right? And I don't think that's intentional, but I think that it's that bias shaping who gets the attention, who gets the credibility, who's awarded the benefit of the doubt.
Would you say that everybody has unconscious bias?
I think growing up in the society that we have, with the media that we take in, right, with the historical legacies that we've had, I think it's impossible for any of us to not have these, right? These are, like I said, these are not necessarily willful. They're not necessarily even a failure of that person's morality. It's the programming that we get from our media, from society, from everything that we take in.
awareness then becomes a critical identifier when addressing unconscious bias, I'm assuming. And so when people become aware of bias, you can easily feel defensive, or it can bring up guilt or even shame. And so, and let's say because that bias is having a discriminatory effect on someone else. And so because of that, it can be easy to dismiss it or even feel bad about not intending to necessarily create that interaction and make it unpleasant, but nonetheless, this pattern is, before you have the time to think about it, is already acted. And so when that's happening, when someone's experiencing whether it's guilt or defensiveness, what's happening emotionally to that individual when they're kind of wrestling with their bias having a negative effect on someone else?
Yeah. No, so that awareness is can at times be really, really impactful. And so when people are confronted with that bias, when they're confronted with their own bias, right? It's not just a cognitive reaction. It's not just a thought process, but it's often very, very deeply emotional, and it's identity based, right? And so what's happening is if somebody gets called out for that bias, then they experience what's called identity threat, right? And so we as people like to see ourselves as fair, good, unbiased. No, I don't have those views. That's not me at all. And yet this bias that this person has just identified goes against that, right? And so now I have a threat to my self-concept. And, it's very natural for people to want to defend that concept. I don't have racist thoughts, and yet this person just said that I have a racist bias. Those two things don't go together, and I want to preserve my identity and that I'm not this person, right? And so we get defensive. We say, that's not me, right? Sometimes people are able to put that aside briefly, and then they feel that guilt of, oh my goodness, I did do that. I just hurt this person with this bias that I have, right? And then we are able to reflect that I did something wrong. And in the best case scenario, that leads us to some self-reflection on how I can start to make changes and how I can interact with other people differently. And sometimes it can create shame, right? And so instead of I did something wrong, now I'm thinking I am something wrong. And shame is very, it's unfortunate because that makes that person withdraw more, right? And the more we withdraw, the more we're left with those associations that we already have, and we're not able to form new ones, right? And so when we're confronting people on bias, trying to shame people or even make people feel overly guilty is probably not the best way, right? And again, when we're confronted with this, it's a very emotional thing. And as we said earlier, that activates our limbic system, right? That fight or flight center. And so you get people this is where sometimes people will double down on that bias because they're really trying to defend themselves. But also at that point, they're less able to think clearly because that really, our prefrontal cortex, which is that smart part of our brain, is now shut off and we're in fight or flight mode, right? And so, it's really important that when we are talking about this, right, and how people should respond in that healthy way, is recognizing that having bias is not the same as endorsing it. Right? I have this, it doesn't mean I believe this, right? And really shifting from a stance of moral judgment, you are a bad person for having this, to being curious, like, where did I get this? Where did these messages come from? What have I been looking at? What did my parents teach me growing up? What am I hearing about different groups that might lead me to have this, right? And it encourages then reflection instead of attacking oneself, right? And so I tell people, if you're feeling defensive, that's a signal. Not that you're a bad person, but that something important is being challenged, right? And you have an opportunity here, right? Now, I will say one of the downsides of this is it's often the most marginalized people and the people who are affected most by this bias that are often in the place to have to call out bias, right? Which puts just another huge emotional burden on people who are marginalized.
For sure. It sounds like what I'm hearing is the awareness piece is critical and kind of, let's call it the first step to, addressing bias. But I'm assuming, but you tell me, is awareness enough, or is there another step to start to rewrite or rewire? And so I guess my question for you is, and just thinking practically and thinking, if I'm a person that wants to unlearn some of these things, or I want to create new patterns or pathways that are more conducive to healthy, especially cross-cultural and diverse and equitable relationships, how does a person genuinely grow and unlearn their biases?
Yeah. No, you're really head on there, because awareness alone is not sufficient, right? It really takes effort. It takes a lot of experience, right, to go through, not just awareness. So the unfortunate part is we have these associations that are kind of programmed into us by society, by culture, by the things that we experience. And so we're not necessarily unlearning, but what we're really trying to do is find, strengthening new associations, and then weakening those older ones, right? The ones that aren't as good. And so, what we're engaged in then is what's called neuroplasticity, right? And we're changing those associations that we have in our brain. So if I'm afraid of dogs because I was bit by a dog, then what I really need to do is be around dogs that are safe. So I can really start to associate, okay, not all dogs are bad. Actually, dogs are kind of cute. So I'm strengthening that association of dogs are cute versus dogs are dangerous, right? And so we have to do that in life as well, right? And so what that might mean is, evidence shows that if we immerse ourselves in repeat counter stereotype exposure, so looking at examples that go counter to those learned associations, right? So maybe seeing diverse leaders and professionals, right, and peers, not just one time, but constant exposure, right? Repeatedly going back, right? Meaningful intergroup contact, which is what you're talking about, is really connecting. And so I always, I teach a class on working with diverse populations at Dal for clinical psych students. And one of the recommendations I give my students is how important it is to immerse yourself in community, right? To be comfortable going to a place where maybe you aren't like everybody else, right? To start to experience it, so that way you get those opportunities to challenge those stereotypes that the media constantly flood us, right? And so and being able to engage in meaningful work with different people from different backgrounds, right? So you have a shared goal, despite maybe some differences there, right? These are some of the strongest real world effects of actually reversing or changing or weakening those biases. And then also structural support. So making sure that, for example, when it comes to hiring, right? Some institutions have actually started to de-identify resumes, so that way they're not able to see the names and then be biased, right? But what doesn't work well is just like a one-off training, right? It doesn't work well with just going, okay, I'm going to interact with a Black person and then that's enough, right? Or the famous, I've got a Black friend. It's not just about that, right? It's really about pausing and asking yourself, okay, what exposures or what assumptions did I just make? And then really asking myself, who's in my circle, right? Whether that's my social circle or my media diet, what am I taking in? And expanding that so that way I'm not just taking in the same information over and over and over again.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's always hope that we can, but it's also the mindfulness, as what you're saying, is exposure, is interaction. And I also would add is to have a sincerity in that, because I do think sometimes these things can be tokenistic or performative. And I think when it comes to, again, in this context, a genuine Christ-like community, I think there also has to be safety and rapport with one another to get it wrong, to be ignorant at times. I know some of my bias I've been able to identify because I've had gracious people to say, Matthew, you need to do something with that perspective, because you might think it's so, but it has a lot of ignorance in it. But I was safe to say it openly, to be kind of enlightened by the reality that's actually my own formed pattern. And so I do think that's a critical thing to have a level of safety to kind of fumble the relearning process at times, but also have a sincerity that you're not just trying to like check box.
And again, like even the research shows that it's the people who actually want to make changes that actually have the longest term change, right? People who don't see it as an issue can still work on changing some of that implicit bias, but it doesn't last as long. It's not as robust. Whereas people who realize, oh, I actually want to do better, right? I want to show up with my community in a more graceful, a more informed way, right? Those are people who, when they go through this, when they, expose themselves to diversity in a way that doesn't just go along with stereotypes, they have really good lasting change.
Jason, do you think it is, because I'm thinking when you're in a monolithic environment where the majority of people, let's say, share maybe the same bias, it can maybe either go ignored or it's just reinforced. It's like a confirmation bias amongst our group, and therefore maybe some of the shadow sides of that in terms of relationships may go unnoticed or have, let's say, a lesser effect. And I'm somewhat speculating here, but do you think that it's even more essential when you're creating and believing for a diverse community that this work of recognizing and addressing becomes a necessity to ensure that we're not harming each other? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, like as we've said, this implicit bias is a normal feature of how the brain works, right? We just happen to have a society that has a history and a legacy and oftentimes current structural imbalances that reinforce those implicit biases. And the consequences of these are not neutral, right? And so oftentimes the consequences for the majority are hidden, right? When it comes to white privilege, white supremacy, all those are parts of our society that are reinforced, but also have an effect of being invisible too, right? We have a society where we say you work hard and you'll get the reward for that, right? And yet in reality, that's only part of it, right? We're all in this race, but some people were able to start earlier because of the way our society is. And so if we want to get to the destination together, right, then that doesn't mean running as fast as we can. It means supporting the people who are there and recognizing, oh my goodness, you started so much farther behind me. I understand that that's not fair. And I need to make sure that I'm doing what I can to support everybody who's on this race, everybody who's on this journey together.
Yeah, for sure. And what I'm hearing really in all that you're saying is not just about information. It's really about formation and deliberately changing those mind bugs that we become aware of. And again, I think that's the beauty too of a multi-ethnic community is I say diversity can either divide or it can sharpen. It can help us better understand one another. So it's either divisive or it can be a great developing tool, because just by virtue of being in close proximity to people that are different, it exposes you. But I think that exposure, and again, as people who follow Jesus, that's what the gospel ultimately does, is an exposing of our soul to be honest with who we are, what we believe, and who we believe God to be, but not to be condemned, but to be transformed. Mm-hmm. And so really this is another exercise in formation and discipleship for folks who sincerely want to follow after Christ as our example. And so, and in doing so, if we want to build diverse and equitable and healthy Christ-centered community, then the direction is inward more so than a outward blaming or just view. And I think you've really helped us, Jason, understand that in a deeper and psychological, emotional way that I hope has been really helpful to the folks listening. So thank you very much for your time and your expertise. And we really enjoyed what you shared with us today.
Well, thank you for having me, and I hope this was helpful.
What does the key concept of racism, that there are many races, do to our concept of humanity? What is a prejudiced opinion of others that you have heard? How do these prejudiced opinions affect us? Hey, thanks for hanging out with us at the same table, a Deepwater Church podcast. To learn more about who we are and where we are, resources we offer, and ways you can get involved, go to deepwaterchurch.com. The Same Table podcast is produced by Deb Wong and Matthew Thomas. Technical production by Deb Wong. Drop us a note if you have any questions, encouraging words, or something you'd like to learn more about at info@deepwaterchurch.com.